Hey there tennis fans, back with another video. Today we're going to talk about errors, and more specifically forced and unforced errors, and what the difference is in forced and unforced errors. Not every mistake that you make on the tennis court it's the same. Okay, there are many types of mistakes that you can make, not only forced and unforced, but also you can make mistakes with your serve, with your return, with your volley, etc. But one simple way to just know yourself better as a player, or know your game better, is to know whether you're making forced or unforced errors, because they do tell a story, and also they tell you, or they can show you what you need to do to win that match that day, or what you need to do to get better with upcoming practice. So what is a forced error? A forced error is what it implies. Player A forces player B to make an error. And the way he forces that could be different things. It could be a lot of spin on the shot. It could be a lot of power. It could be the angle, the depth, or like a drop shot. That could also be a forced error. But basically, it's not that player B never had a chance. It's not that. It's just that even though he could have had a chance to get the ball in, the mistake came from the player A's forcing the error. So it's kind of an excusable error for player B, since an error was likely because of the shot that they had to, get back. Whereas an unforced error is where player A does not hit the ball with any substantial power, spin, or angle, or depth. So the reason the player B made the mistake is because they tried too hard, or they just didn't execute right. So that's an unforced error. Hi there tennis fans, I hope you're enjoying the video. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a like, leave a comment, and also hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. I am really thankful that you're watching. Now let's get back to the video. Why is it important to understand the difference between forced and unforced? Well, if you're going to a match and you're making a lot of forced errors, most likely you're playing against someone above your level, because you can't handle their spin, their power, or whatever it is. And if you're going to a match and you make a lot of unforced errors, that means you're not focused, or you need to practice more, or you're just trying too hard to beat the player, and you probably are better off just cutting back on the unforced errors by hitting through the middle of the court with a lot of spin so you can get the ball in, and see if the player can actually force an error. Usually, but not always, the player who makes the least unforced errors wins the match. This is a very important number. At the end of a match, if you look at the unforced errors that each player made, I would say that most of the time the player with the more unforced errors loses the match. To know whether an error was forced and unforced, it just takes a trained eye. Any teaching pro is able to tell the difference between an unforced or forced error, but sometimes players don't really see these things, because especially when they're the ones playing,
You didn't move. You didn't move right.
a tennis teaching pro usually gets to see what's going on and they're not involved. But for players, it's a little harder to tell what's going on because they're engaged in the point. So some players cannot tell whether they made a forced or unforced error. The funny thing about it is that a lot of players make forced errors and they get really upset. And when I go into a match, I know that I'm going to make both forced and unforced errors. When I make a forced error, I don't really get that upset, or not at all, because it was just my opponent just hit a good shot. Okay, they could have been lucky. I just got good timing on the shot, or whatever it was. I cannot get upset about forced errors, because all I can do is just play the point better. But the error itself wasn't why I lost the point, probably. Whereas an unforced error, if I'm making unforced errors, then as soon as I start to make unforced errors, my goal is to focus more, see the bounce better, and just be more conservative with my game, and just get the ball in more and see if my opponent can actually force the error. And also, it helps if you can tell whether your opponent is making unforced errors or forced errors. Because if your opponent is making unforced errors, then that means they're tight and they just can't get a rhythm.
Those are too tight. Those are way too tight.
Yeah, but I mean, does it look weird?
So you're probably better off just getting the ball in and let them make the mistakes. You don't have to take much of a risk. But if your opponent is only making forced errors, that means that you still need to play aggressive to win the match. Because if you hold back on the amount of power or spin you're putting, it's more likely that your opponent will, turn it around. A good example of a forced or unforced error is, take a look at the return of serve. If you're playing against a player who has a good serve, and let's say they have a very good first serve, but they just dink it at the second serve, then if that's the case, if you miss the first serve return, so if you hit the return and you miss it on their first serve, then that was probably a forced error, since it came with power, spin, and all that. But if the player hits the second serve and they just dink it in, and you miss it, the return, then that's more likely an unforced error, and you should cut back on those. Forced errors and unforced errors are just part of every single tennis match. So get used to it, and also try to differentiate and see where your game is and where your opponent is. That usually will give you some kind of strategy. I hope you like this video, guys. Subscribe and all that. Take care.